Everyone remembers the fights. They remember the warehouse shootouts, the brutal showdown with Paulie, Quinn's return, and Reacher finally settling a score that had haunted him for years. Those are the moments that dominate conversations about Reacher Season 3. But after watching the entire season again, something surprising starts to happen. The action stops being the most interesting part of the story. Instead, the biggest revelations begin appearing in the quiet moments between the violence. A glance that lasts a second too long. A line of dialogue that feels ordinary until 6 episodes later. A decision that doesn't make sense until the finale completely changes its meaning. That's the brilliance of this season. The writers weren't just telling one investigation. They were teaching us how Jack Reacher solves every case. He doesn't chase the obvious clue. He notices the detail everyone else ignores. And the clever part is that the audience is challenged to do exactly the same thing. So today, we're going back through all 8 episodes to uncover the hidden clues that quietly shape the entire season from the very beginning. Some of them foreshadow major twists. Others completely change how certain characters should be viewed. And one of them may explain why Quinn was already losing long before Reacher ever came face to face with him. Before we dive in, if you enjoy these deep breakdowns, hidden details, and theory videos, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I spend hours digging through episodes, connecting clues, comparing dialogue, and piecing together details that are easy to miss on a first watch. If that's your kind of content, you're in the right place. Fair warning, this video contains spoilers for all 8 episodes of Reacher Season 3. If you haven't finished the season yet, now's your chance to catch up before we start connecting every clue the writers left behind. The very first hidden clue appears before Reacher has even begun investigating the Beck organization. In Episode 1, he isn't searching for a criminal empire. He steps in because something about a seemingly ordinary situation doesn't feel right. That's one of the oldest storytelling tricks in the Reacher series. Every season begins with what looks like a small, isolated incident before slowly revealing something much larger underneath. In Margrave, it was a murder. In Season 2, it was the death of an old friend. Here, it's an encounter that seems almost accidental. The writers are quietly reminding us that Reacher never goes looking for conspiracies. Conspiracies reveal themselves because he refuses to accept simple explanations. That pattern is so consistent across the series that it becomes the audience's first clue. Whenever the story appears straightforward, it almost certainly isn't. The second clue is hidden inside Zachary Beck's behavior. On a first viewing, Beck looks exactly like the kind of ruthless criminal Reacher has dealt with countless times before. He's distant, intimidating, and always seems to be calculating his next move. But watch his scenes again after finishing the season. Notice how often he hesitates before making decisions involving Richard. His expressions change almost imperceptibly whenever his son enters the room. The dialogue tells us Beck is a dangerous man, but his body language tells a more complicated story. He isn't simply protecting his operation. He's constantly trying to balance fear, loyalty, and fatherhood at the same time. That contradiction is planted long before the truth becomes obvious, and it transforms Beck from a one-dimensional villain into someone trapped by choices he can no longer escape. Then there's Richard Beck, and this is where the writers become especially clever. Richard spends much of the season looking like the weakest person in the room. He's inexperienced, uncertain, and completely overshadowed by the violent world surrounding him. That's exactly how the camera encourages us to see him. But Reacher doesn't judge people by appearances, and neither should we. Look closely at how Richard observes conversations instead of interrupting them. He watches before speaking. He listens more than he talks. Those aren't random character traits. They're subtle hints that Richard understands far more about his father's world than he lets anyone believe. The writers repeatedly place him in the background of important scenes, allowing him to absorb information while the audience focuses on louder, more dramatic characters. It's a quiet form of storytelling that pays off, because Richard's perspective gradually becomes one of the season's emotional anchors. Another clue hiding in Episode 1 is something Reacher himself never says out loud. He rarely explains why he distrusts someone immediately. Instead, the audience watches him notice tiny inconsistencies, a delayed answer, a forced smile, an explanation that technically makes sense but doesn't quite fit the situation. This is one of the defining characteristics of Reacher's investigative style. He doesn't solve cases through luck. He solves them because he pays attention to behavior instead of words. The writers invite us to adopt the same mindset. Every time someone offers an explanation that feels just a little too convenient, Reacher doesn't argue. He simply files it away. Hours later, those tiny inconsistencies become the foundation of the entire investigation. It's a reminder that the biggest clues in Reacher aren't usually hidden in action scenes. They're hidden in conversations that seem completely ordinary the first time you hear them. And that leads directly to one of the smartest storytelling decisions of the entire season. The writers never introduce Quinn as just another villain waiting for the finale. His presence hangs over the story long before he physically dominates it. Through fragmented conversations, lingering memories, and the emotional weight carried by Reacher himself, Quinn becomes a shadow stretching across every episode. By the time he finally steps fully into the spotlight, it doesn't feel like a new character has arrived. It feels like a ghost the season has been quietly warning us about from the very beginning. That's the difference between a memorable antagonist and an ordinary one. Quinn isn't dangerous simply because of what he does. He's dangerous because the story teaches us to fear him before we ever truly see him. The next hidden clue changes the entire emotional foundation of Season 3, and it arrives through Dominique Cole. At first, the flashbacks seem to serve one obvious purpose. They explain why Quinn is different from every villain Reacher has faced before. But once you step back and look at the structure of the season, those scenes accomplish something much more important. They're not building Quinn's story, they're rebuilding Reacher's. Previous seasons introduced him as a man who drifted from town to town because that's simply who he was. Season 3 quietly reveals another layer. Reacher doesn't just keep moving because he enjoys freedom. He keeps moving because some chapters of his life are too painful to stay with for very long. Dominique represents a failure that has never stopped following him. Every flashback isn't simply showing us the past. It's showing us the weight Reacher has been carrying long before the audience ever met him. By the time Quinn finally reappears, this isn't just another mission. It's the first case where the investigation is inseparable from Reacher's own history. That becomes even clearer when you pay attention to how Quinn is introduced. Most television villains announce themselves with violence. Quinn doesn't need to. Long before he's standing in front of Reacher, the other characters are already reacting to him. People hesitate when his name comes up. Conversations become shorter. Information suddenly becomes difficult to obtain. Fear reaches the audience before Quinn ever does, and that's deliberate. Great storytellers understand that anticipation is often more powerful than action. The writers aren't asking us to fear Quinn because he's physically dangerous. They're asking us to fear the damage his reputation has already caused. By the time he enters the story, our opinion has already been shaped by everyone else's reaction to him. It's a subtle piece of storytelling that mirrors real life. Truly powerful people rarely have to remind everyone who they are. The room changes the moment their name is mentioned. Now look at Paulie, because this is another place where first impressions can be misleading. It's easy to dismiss him as the season's unstoppable giant, the inevitable physical obstacle Reacher has to overcome before reaching Quinn. But Paulie isn't just there to provide a spectacular fight scene. He's there to demonstrate how Quinn controls people. Paulie isn't presented as a brilliant strategist or a mastermind. He's presented as certainty made flesh. Wherever Paulie goes, resistance becomes pointless, because his very presence convinces people they've already lost. That's psychological warfare disguised as muscle. Quinn understands something that Reacher understands just as well. Fear often wins battles before the first punch is ever thrown. Paulie is the visual representation of that philosophy. He isn't protecting Quinn because he's the strongest man in the room. He's protecting Quinn because people believe no one can beat him. Once Reacher breaks that illusion, Quinn's entire system of intimidation begins collapsing with it. Here's where another fascinating pattern starts to emerge. Throughout the middle episodes, almost every important breakthrough happens after Reacher stops listening to what people are saying and starts paying attention to what they're avoiding. That's one of the oldest investigative techniques in the series. Honest people usually answer questions directly. People hiding something often answer a different question entirely. Watch the conversations again, especially those involving Beck and the people closest to Quinn's operation. Notice how often information is redirected instead of denied. That's an important difference. Direct lies can eventually be disproven. Half-truths are much harder to expose because parts of them are technically accurate. The writers build entire scenes around this idea. Every conversation gives Reacher enough information to move forward, while simultaneously revealing that someone is carefully controlling what remains unsaid. The investigation advances because Reacher recognizes those gaps long before anyone else does. One detail that's surprisingly easy to overlook is how often Reacher simply watches. Modern action heroes usually rush toward the next fight, but Reacher frequently does the opposite. He pauses. He studies people entering a room. He notices who speaks first, who stays silent, who avoids eye contact, and who seems just a little too comfortable during dangerous situations. Those quiet observations rarely receive dramatic music or flashy camera movements. In fact, the show almost hides them beneath ordinary dialogue. That's exactly why they're so important. Reacher's greatest weapon isn't his strength, it's patience. The writers repeatedly reward viewers who adopt that same patience. If you slow down and observe the scenes the way Reacher does, you start recognizing the hidden patterns before the characters openly discuss them. Then there's the Beck family itself, which quietly becomes one of the season's biggest surprises. Early on, it's tempting to view everyone connected to the Beck operation as part of the same criminal machine. But the deeper the story goes, the more obvious it becomes that fear is holding this family together far more than loyalty. That's a crucial distinction. Criminal organizations built on loyalty can survive enormous setbacks because people genuinely believe in the cause. Organizations built on fear begin falling apart the moment that fear disappears. The writers plant this idea long before the final episodes, by showing hesitation, uncertainty, and moments where characters seem trapped rather than committed. Once you recognize that pattern, the ending becomes much easier to understand. Reacher doesn't simply defeat people through force. He exposes the cracks that were already spreading through Quinn's operation from the inside. And that's what makes the middle of Season 3 so rewarding on a second viewing. Every episode quietly shifts the audience away from asking, "How will Reacher beat these people?" toward a much more interesting question, "How long have they already been falling apart?" By the time the action reaches its peak, the answer has been sitting in front of us for several episodes. Quinn appears unstoppable because everyone around him behaves as though he is. But beneath that image are frightened partners, conflicted allies, damaged families, and people surviving one day at a time, rather than believing in the empire they've built. Reacher doesn't create those weaknesses, he simply notices them before anyone else. That's the hidden clue connecting the entire middle of the season, and it's exactly why the final confrontation feels earned instead of convenient. The villains don't lose because Reacher is invincible. They lose because he sees the fractures they spent years pretending didn't exist. By the time the season reaches episodes 6 and 7, the writers quietly begin changing the way the audience sees the investigation. Up until this point, it feels as though Reacher is slowly working his way toward Quinn, removing one obstacle after another. But look closer, and you'll notice the direction of the story has actually reversed. Reacher is no longer simply hunting Quinn. Quinn has started reacting to Reacher. That may sound like a small distinction, but it completely changes the balance of power. Earlier in the season, Reacher is the unknown variable slipping into a criminal operation. Later, the operation itself starts changing because of him. Characters become nervous, plans become rushed. Mistakes that never would have happened earlier suddenly begin appearing. The writers never stop the action to point this out, but it's one of the season's smartest hidden details. Reacher's greatest victories don't happen during the fights. They happen when his enemies abandon their own plans because they're too busy responding to him. One of the most overlooked clues appears in the way Quinn handles information. Throughout the season, Quinn rarely tells anyone more than they absolutely need to know. Every member of his organization understands one small piece of the larger operation, but almost nobody sees the whole picture. That isn't just good criminal strategy. It's a recurring theme across the entire season. Compartmentalization becomes Quinn's greatest strength and, eventually, his biggest weakness. The moment one piece of the machine begins to fail, the rest can't adapt because nobody understands how everything fits together. Rewatch those later episodes and pay attention to how often characters are confused, surprised, or forced to ask for clarification. Those moments aren't there simply to move the plot forward. They're quietly showing that Quinn has built an empire where ignorance is treated as security. It works perfectly until someone like Reacher starts connecting the pieces that no one person was ever supposed to assemble. Then there's a visual clue that becomes much more obvious during a second viewing. Notice how often Reacher is framed alone, even when surrounded by allies. The camera repeatedly isolates him in doorways, hallways, parking lots, and open spaces, while everyone else is grouped together. On the surface, it's a reminder that Reacher is a drifter who never truly belongs anywhere. But it also reinforces something much deeper. Every major decision in the season ultimately falls on him alone. He can accept advice, gather information, and work alongside others, but when the critical moment arrives, the responsibility is always his. It's a subtle visual language the series has used since Season 1, and Season 3 leans into it more than ever. The lonely framing isn't just stylistic. It reflects the burden Reacher willingly carries every time he chooses to get involved. Another hidden pattern runs through the season's dialogue. The villains constantly talk about power in terms of money, influence, fear, and control. Reacher almost never does. His conversations revolve around facts, evidence, and people. That difference is easy to overlook because it's buried beneath the action, but it's one of the reasons he consistently wins. Quinn believes controlling people means controlling outcomes. Reacher understands that controlling information is what actually decides the battle. That's why he keeps asking simple questions everyone else ignores. Who benefits? Who's lying? Why doesn't this story make sense? Those questions gradually dismantle an organization that appears untouchable. The writers are quietly contrasting two completely different ways of seeing the world, and by the finale, it's obvious which philosophy is stronger. The fight with Paulie is another scene that's often remembered for its brutality, but the deeper meaning is hidden beneath the punches. Paulie isn't simply the season's biggest physical challenge. He's the final symbol of Quinn's entire system. For most of the season, Paulie exists as living proof that brute force can keep people obedient. Every time someone looks at him, they're reminded what happens if they resist. But Reacher doesn't just defeat Paulie, he destroys the illusion Paulie represents. Once that illusion collapses, Quinn loses something even more valuable than his strongest enforcer. He loses the fear that has been holding his organization together. It's a payoff the writers have been building toward for several episodes without ever explaining it outright. The real victory isn't that Reacher beats the strongest man in the room. It's that everyone watching realizes strength alone was never enough to protect Quinn's empire. As the finale approaches, another fascinating clue begins to emerge. The pace of the storytelling subtly changes. Earlier episodes spend time gathering information, building relationships, and uncovering secrets. The final episodes become much faster, but that speed isn't random. It's showing us that once the truth reaches a certain point, events begin accelerating beyond anyone's control. Quinn can no longer carefully manage every situation. Beck can no longer balance two different lives. Even people trying to stay out of the conflict are forced to choose a side. The season quietly suggests that lies require constant maintenance, while the truth only needs one opportunity to spread. Once Reacher uncovers enough of it, the conspiracy doesn't collapse because of one dramatic speech or one lucky discovery. It collapses because every hidden contradiction starts surfacing at the same time. And that brings us to one of the biggest hidden clues in the entire season. Reacher never actually wins because he's the smartest person in every room or because he's stronger than everyone he fights. He wins because he never allows the story to become more complicated than it needs to be. While everyone else is distracted by money, revenge, loyalty, and power, Reacher keeps asking the same basic question from the beginning to the end. What's the truth? Every clue, every conversation, every decision points back to that single objective. That's why the season feels so satisfying on a second watch. Once you know the ending, you realize the writers weren't hiding the answers. They were hiding them in plain sight, trusting the audience to notice the same patterns that Reacher notices. And in doing so, Season 3 quietly teaches us its biggest lesson. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones people tell. They're the ones everyone else is willing to believe.